And the white pieces started with e4. We're in the Sicilian on move 1, and I made this segue to the Staunton-Cochrane variation. This can also be considered part of the English opening and the reverse Sicilian. It's the Staunton-Cochrane variation in this context, and knight to c6. My opponent is playing very classic ways at controlling the center, and so am I. Knight to c3. We have a mirror position with white to move on move 4. I develop my knight to f3. d6 is fine. d3 is fine. I find this formation of pawns very common in the English opening games, and you'll I've started to get a feel for where, especially white's queenside knight, might be able to place himself as part of an attack. You see that the kingside knight is pretty much stymied from moving towards the center. The hole on d4 is so extremely under black's control that the kingside knight is not likely to be participating in a central movement. Sometimes off to g5 or h4 even, but more often this knight's going to be here, and as white you're going to want to protect that knight with something other than just the queen on d1, where this knight could become pinned. And the knight at f1 moves to the bishop at f1 can move to e2 to break that pin in a lot of variations. And why not? That bishop is on f1 and he's got all these pawns around him on light colored squares. This is a bad bishop for white, of course, right? We know that a bishop that's locked on the same color squares as its own pawns is a bad bishop, and in this case he turns out to actually be a bad bishop. So giving him the duty of bishop to e2 in a way that protects an otherwise pinned piece is making the most use of his presence. Knight to d5, because where else? To b5, and the knight will be forced back by black's playing a6. Alright, it's a central move by white. It's okay. It's definitely a good or excellent move. And here for black, this is not a bad move. Bishop e6, right? We're getting at this strong knight, but I'm not sure that bishop g4 could put the question to, well, could make white think. But then again, bishop e2 undoes the pin. So I rather taking that back then. I think this move, bishop to e6, is fine. Just no problem. He might have gone away with bishop e7 and tempted white to exchange this very powerful, awesome knight on d5. Exchange that off for black's dark squared bishop, which is like white's light squared bishop, a bad bishop. Alright, so that might have done. Otherwise, bishop at c8 to e6 is a fine move anyway. My opponent can't let my knight on d5 just sit there for the rest of the game. He'll find some high value target to attack. So I took the other side of this game. I think white can pretty much claim advantage here. The reason why is I'm pinning the f7, the f6 knight. My opponent will have to play now bishop e7, and then white captures that bishop, winning the minor exchange. But yeah, okay, like I just said, it's a bad bishop at that. I'll capture that bishop, and recaptures is most likely with the queen because the knight at c6 doubles back to e7, and white will be able to double black's pawns. And so the queen captures, and the pin is still alive against black's f6 knight. White will have a slight edge in that game, very slight edge. Okay, so this is in fact what we saw. And with white to move here, I'm going to say white has the advantage. Black can castle at a moment's notice to either side, so that's strong in terms of king safety. Black has an edge or an advantage in king safety, but white's not doing all that bad either. A move from one of these two pieces, the bishop at f1 or the queen on d1, and white can castle to probably the king side, but in some cases the queen side. Okay, so white's doing fine in king safety, and black's doing a little bit better. And the other measures, you know, we're talking about approximately the same amount of space. The clock is approximately the same. Neither side really has a huge advantage in terms of the initiative on the other. Materials even if white has won the minor exchange, so this is even. Materials even. So that's that. In terms of mobility, I might give a very slight edge to black. This powerful knight on c6 has a lot of mobility. Once the pin is broken, this knight on f6 has a lot of mobility. Black has a very strong light squared bishop with a decent amount of mobility. And so overall, a very slight edge. Yeah, I had said that I might consider this in favor of white, based mostly on mobility, and the way to move into king safety. I'm going to say that black is very slightly ahead. Developing moves. Now this move, knight to d4, I think I handled it correctly, as Stockfish agrees with knight takes d4, and then black reclaims the material. So what do we do here? We're white. It's white's turn to move. What's the game plan? This is one of those rare, well, from time to time you play a game of chess, you reach a point where what's there to do? The game isn't over. It's definitely not a draw. It's your turn to move. The game is pretty much, as the CPU calculates here, the game is pretty much dead even. It's totally even who's winning, who's not. Here's when you have to start thinking, this is a moment for coming up with a plan. There's a couple of different plans that white could pursue here. One would be a kingside pawn storm. I didn't like that. I didn't like that at the time because I didn't consider that at the time. But right now, I don't like it because I feel that with a pawn on h4, black can reply with h6 to great effect, and either I have to lose my bishop pair or double back to some more defensive square. Now noting that bishop back to d2 contains the inherent threat of bishop to b4, and then we might have tactics along these major pieces along the a3 f8 diagonal. But I wasn't keen on the dynamic chances that follow for white. Not only that, but pawn to h4, and then we have this sort of gap in white's kingside defenses should white choose to castle kingside. It's not a crazy gap, but it's a little bit. It's slightly less safe for white's king. And we see here that queenside castling is possible by rules of the game, but I'm not a huge fan of that because of all the air that would exist around white's king. So I played b4, looking for space on the queen side. Black plays h6 anyway, because there's no way he can suffer this pin on f6 for all too long. If the queen moves her square, then white captures, and upon recaptures, there'll be this semi-open file bearing right down the straights at black's king on g8. Bishop h4. I was assessed a mistake for that. I think it's perhaps better was bishop to d2. Let's see what our Silicon friend likes. Bishop to d2, and in a totally different vein, bishop takes f6. But I'm not giving away my bishop pair out of this popcorn fart. So instead of that, and I didn't like bishop d2 is just what are we backing down from? What's the reason for backing down all the way to d2? So I played bishop h4, and then our dark squared bishop is nice and protected on g3 in front of where white's king is most likely to end up. And not only that, if the bishop is pursued by advancing pawns, we have options for that. It's not it's something I'm aware of, but not scared of. Bishop to d7. Yeah, this is the problem with an even board with no clear direction. What do you choose? You have to come up with a plan. Bishop to d7. It's not a horrible move, but where's the plan? I play queen back to d1. Now my plan makes sense. So I still have this space on the one side. The principle of two weaknesses. We'll say I have space on one side, and now I have the beginnings of an attack on the king side. For instance, bishop to h5. Oops. Let's do a pawn move. Bishop to h5, and then with knight takes h5, queen takes h5. This is strong for white. There's no, at least this part of the board. At least this part of the board is strong for white. There's no clear way for black to unseat the dangerously posted white queen, right? You would think, okay, maybe bishop f5 and then to g6, but not only that, that's two moves, and the pawn on e4 isn't going anywhere. That bishop on f5 is going to get gobbled before he gets to g6. So this is a long term. This is the type of thing, frankly, that Silicon might still not underestimate. I'm not entirely sure about that, but this is a long-term subtle threat, and black has no way at present to really deal with it convincingly. We would say probably king to g7 or even h7, but those are concessions, and if we know that this space around black's king is a weakness, then this queen on h5 is definitely the way to exploit that weakness. Anyway, that's in other news, or that's how it could have ended. And bishop h5. I think it's a strong move anyway. Even with the knight on h7, this is still a strong move. It's taking up an advanced position against the enemy king. Here, white has one good move. After black creates more air around his king, it's probably again why this is considered an inaccuracy. Black has ceded a lot of king safety to move f7 to f5. It's unclear why or how come he would do that. I like even knight back to f6, and Stockfish agrees. And if I move back to e2 and the knight goes back to h7, black might be able to claim a draw on repetition. So anyway, f5 was played. I found the right move in response. That's pawn at e4 captures f5. Bishop takes f5, and here's from where we evaluated earlier. Here from where we evaluated earlier is a different story. White's superior in terms of king safety, space. I'd say white's superior in terms of space. You might want to consider the king side pawns part of space, but that's not the type of space you want to have in front of your king. So white is superior in terms of space. Material is still even, though white has the bishop pair, black does not. Black has about a minute and a half lead on white, or more time. Black has about a minute and a half more time than white, so black is doing better on the clock. Black is superior on the clock. In terms of initiative here, it's black's turn to move. I'm not sure that either side has much initiative, which means black does, because it's black's turn to move. And I think there's enough pressures on the king side, space on the queen side, king safety at home, that this is part of the reason why you see a move like b6. This is just a blunder. Why would you open up the rook to that kind of diagonal for this, slow move? Maybe there are thoughts of putting queen on b7 or something, but that I don't think that's the greatest move. It's hard to find a truly great move here from black, but it's not b6. I play bishop to f3, and again the position and the tension in the position induce errors by black, where now white has gone ahead of the exchange, and cleanly so. Rook e1, and this is the correct rook to move to e1, especially when the queen's in the way. But rook moves to e1, and this is the review considers this a blunder, and I'm going to revisit this on my own. It probably is. What I'm thinking here is 2 pawns for a bishop, right? But what else does white gain? An open game where he has a material advantage, and at least for right now, a really strong pin on the bishop at e6. Pin to the queen, and there's our major pieces ready to jump into action to maybe overwhelm the defense of the bishop under siege at e6. Because again, this is the kind of pressure induces mistakes. Pressure creates folly. So this pressure and the search for a great move or a good move brings us to Queen F7. I'm not sure if I jumped on that. Like I said, simple play that the major pieces on the first rank are now ready to jump into battle quickly. And we're piling on the bishop. Just note that the bishop won't possibly to D7. 1, 2, 3. Bishop D7 is also the computer recommended move. I think that white still bursts through. Yeah. White still bursts through with the nifty move Rook E6 on move 28 here. You can see this diagram stemming from the calculations that the engine does. That is a lot more challenging for white to make a win out of. It's a lot more challenging for white to create a win from this position. So best play for black here was Bishop D7, and it's seen as still white ahead by almost a full minor piece. This is a lot more difficult to prove a win as white. 2 minor pieces. The pawns are not, there's no pawns like, wow, this pawn is falling immediately, so maybe that's the tipping point, but this is just not an easy win for white to prove. The way things occurred in the game, under the pressures of time and all that, my opponent moved King G7, and upon Rook takes E6, I'm simply winning a piece here, with the simplification of a queen exchange as well. The pawn on D4 was a bad and difficult to support or protect weak pawn, but getting it out of the way right away also opens up white's main threats here. So white's very safe, doesn't have to worry about this back rank issue on rank 1. So the opponent has no rooks. As my grandfather would say, yes, we have no bananas. So this, there's a pin on the knight at e5, and it's probably the clearest way to pursue victory here. I think I can even get away with captures and recaptures, and then just be overpowering on both the king side with the 2v1 pawn majority, in the middle with the d pawn as a passed pawn, and on the queen side probably hold things to a standstill with b5, and a2 could become even a last resort. I'll pursue that. I'm going to show that in just a moment. And first we're going to show how the game finished, as it were. And here my opponent resigned because once the king moves off of the pin, the knight falls, and maybe even the h5 pawn right after that. So this is a hopeless position. I'm not a hopeless person.